Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Empowering Musicians podcast. I am your host, Michael Manley, and I'm very happy to be welcoming Hannah Kuhn to this week's episode. And Hannah is a labor organizer working with freelance musicians in San Francisco's Bay Area to win fair standards and wages and safe workplaces. So welcome to the show, Hannah.
Glad to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to talk today about, freelance organizing.
Awesome. Well, why don't we start out with the fact that you started out as a cellist, right? You still are a cellist. And that's great. Your cello is in the back there. My French horn's on the floor down here. You can't see it.
Bach is back there as well.
Bach. You can never go wrong with Bach. So and then you transitioned, or you expanded from that, I should say, into organizing. So why don't we start with just where you began in your career as a musician and how you got into the work that you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So like Michael said, I am a cellist. That's what I've trained all of my life to do. I don't think when I picked cello that I necessarily thought worker. So of course it's challenging work. We put in so many hours and we love to do it. So I think most people, I went off to college, I got my degree in performance, and I went back home and I started working. I went back to Tennessee and I started gigging. I was a freelance musician, playing for all sorts. I would play for the local orchestra that had a CBA, that had a collective bargaining agreement. But most of my work was freelance, playing for, a church every weekend until I got my steady church gig, playing for various bands until I settled down into a couple that I would gig with, playing for weddings with my quartet, forming a quartet. So that was my work. I was a freelance cellist who played in a lot of different genre spheres, but mostly classical, rock, playing with bands of a lot of different genres in Chattanooga. And all of that made me a worker, right? I was working. And the transition to organizer, I think, was a pretty predictable one. I was gigging, I was playing with the local symphony, and one of the fellow musicians sat down next to me and was like, "Hey, have you ever heard of the AFM? Have you ever thought about joining?" And I had heard of the AFM. I hadn't thought about joining. But I think I said something along the lines of, well, I thought I would join the union when I started getting union gigs. And he was like, well, maybe let's talk about that and think about how we can turn that around, where all of the gigs you already do are things that respect you and you have dignity in. And so that began a relationship with labor that I was not expecting. And it was very quickly that I ended up serving with the local in Chattanooga as their labor council delegate. And I began to be educated by my fellow workers in Chattanooga of all sorts of fields, firefighters, boiler makers, nurses, teachers, bus drivers, all sorts, right? Coming together in the labor councils to share skills, to do campaigns together. Took a couple years, but eventually I started relating that to my own work, because that wasn't a natural thing, because freelancers aren't organized, right? And it's in the name. So, eventually I started applying it to my own work. And I think we'll get into that more. But I started organizing with my fellow musicians in Chattanooga, and with that friend now who sat down next to me, right, and said, "Hey, have you ever heard of the AFM? Have you ever thought about joining the union?" And And so, yeah, that was the start of it. That was kind of how I got into it, Michael. And obviously, it's a long story, but I think the essence of that, right, is the basics of what labor is. One of my fellow coworkers sat down next to me and had a conversation with me. That wasn't like wagging the finger, right? It was a real come along kind of thing. It was,
Yeah.
Well, we're in this together, right?
Right.
Union gigs don't just materialize. They happen when workers want them to be that way, right? When they want to have a voice at the table. So that's how I got into this. And it really guides my values in the labor movement.
That's a great narrative. And I love the fact that you early on called yourself a working musician or a worker. And that's not something that we're taught in school. We're taught that we're artists. We're taught that we're gifted. We're taught that we have this amazing talent that we bring to the world. But nobody tells us we're actually going to be workers, right? That when we get into the real world, we're working musicians. And I always use that term instead of professional. I don't like, because working means I'm trying to translate this into putting food on my table. And professional has an artistic kind of value to a lot of people versus a value of like, am I doing this as my job? So I think that's a great way to frame it. And so for those people who might be asking, because we're seeing, in our culture right now, we see strikes happening. We see right now we have a UAW strike going on. And you alluded to the fact that like things don't naturally happen, right? Like the 8-hour workday didn't happen. It was people fighting for it. And in cases dying for it. And so if people are looking at this going, okay, somehow all these auto workers just together woke up one day and said, oh, we're going to all have the same thought of going on strike, right? Like that's not how it happens. And so what actually is organizing for those people who may be wondering?
Yeah, so I love this question. What is organizing? It's one of the first ones I grappled with because I think like most people, when we put our volunteer time into things, we want to make sure that it's going to bring real change in the world, right? And it's good that we're selfish about that. And so that definition of what is organizing becomes really important. So I love to talk about this. And I think I use a really simple kind of base point for what is organizing. The first thing, and it comes from a great organizer, Marshall Gantz. He suggests that organizing is 3 questions, right? It's who are my people, right? And who are my people? They're all freelance musicians. Maybe specifically in that story, it was Chattanooga freelance musicians, the people I grew up with, people who had moved into town and made lives for themselves in Chattanooga and wanted to make good lives that had dignity. And it was a great location next to Nashville, right? So you can go up and gig in Nashville. And so it was musicians. It was freelance musicians. The second question, what is their urgent issue? This can get really difficult to figure out, right? But and the third question is, what are our resources to move on that issue, right? To create change. All of this is about creating change. Organizing is always about creating change. It's never about maintaining the status quo. So that's what organizing is in a really simple, like 3-question way. Who are my people? What are their urgent issues? And what are the resources we have together to change them? In another way, I also just want to point out that there's a lot of different ways we get change. There are 3 kind of archetypes of change making. You've got advocacy, which is like, you're going to get a bill changed, maybe none of the impacted people are actually engaged in the process of change, right? But it's still great. We still need our advocates. We still need them out in the world fighting that good fight, right?
Yeah.
Because occasionally that advocacy turns into mobilizing, right? Where all of a sudden because some issue is so deeply and widely felt. We saw this with the Black Lives Matter issues, right? Around all sorts of issues with police brutality, with the private prison industry, with bail reform, right? There were masses of people that were engaged who came out every day to really accentuate this issue together, right? But to your point, Michael, they didn't all make the decision together to do that, right? It was kind of, in a way magical, although many people had laid the groundwork for that mobilizing to be impactful.
Yeah.
And then finally, in this trio of archetypes of change is organizing. And the big thing that distinguishes organizing from these other two is that really organizing is all about talking to people you've never talked to, right? That are impacted, probably who share issues to you. And so it's really important that that always be the focus. If you're trying to organize, the value that you need to maintain from A to Z is, am I talking to people I've never talked to before, right? If you're not, likely you're doing mobilizing or advocacy, which is great, right? We need a many-headed, Hydra type of snake to deal with the issues that we have right now, right?
Yeah.
So we need advocacy. We need mobilizing. We have advocacy. Sometimes we have mobilizing. I think where we have had a loss, not just in the musicians field, but in every industry, is organizing. And organizing is really putting bodies in front of bodies who have never talked before, who share similar issues, right? Who are the people that should be, who are my people, right? It's putting freelance musicians in front of freelance musicians. It's putting nurses in front of nurses. It's putting bus drivers in front of bus drivers. So that's what organizing is. It's having conversations. Those conversations usually lead to planning and campaigns, right? But at the very base of organizing can't be something that doesn't have that dynamic, right? So that's kind of the simple way I think about organizing, and the simple, what's it called, barometer of whether or not I'm really organizing, because it can be easy to lose sight.
Yeah. I love that way you described it, because it's so clear. And I think of like advocacy and mobilizing in my own head as like internal organizing in a way, because we're talking to people we already know, as you say, and sometimes we do internal organizing that's more engaged than that. But external organizing, or what we call external organizing, would be really talking to those people we don't know. But really, that's all organizing, right? If we're not talking to the people we don't yet know, we're only talking among ourselves. I think that's really an important point that you're raising.
Yeah, and I think we can make that same mistake though internally, right? So let's say you call a meeting. Let's make this very real, right? You call a meeting and you invite everybody. Is that organizing? No, because you still have to interlay. It can be, but you have to add the tactics that put the people in front of the people, right? One-on-one to get to that meeting, right? So if you send out an email, it's like, we're having a meeting, and 3 people show up, that's great. Celebrate that. And then turn that into organizing, because those people self-selected, they're not the people who never show up, right? And that's the point. Even internally, you could have a unit where only 30% ever take action. Well, that's not going to work, Right. So even internally, you can still find that same dynamic. Maybe you know their names, but Melissa has never talked to Roger. And that's the dynamic that you want to create, even though maybe they literally sit right next to each other at work. Yeah. And internal or external, it's just the most important tactic that really, it is organizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find that when I've had folks come to me and say, well, I know this musician, they're really annoyed. They're just really mad about their situation. And I say, great. Well, the first step is we have to like map the workers. So maybe, you know, set up a conversation with that musician and myself, or you and that musician, and let's just come up with a list of everybody who's worked on that job. And what I find is that's where the process breaks down for musicians for some reason, and maybe other workers too, is that nobody wants to do that first work of saying, oh, let's actually do that work and find out who is on this job or who else is doing the same thing I'm doing. And I think it's that natural tendency to only want to talk to people we already know. That's part of it.
Yeah, and that dynamic too, mapping and charting, usually people have never done it before, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I like to be really, you know, empathetic to the fact that whenever we're doing new things, generally we want to do them with people we trust, right? So even mapping and charting, it requires a level of trust among maybe just say, you know, 2 or 3 workers, and that can take, yeah, those conversations to build. So it's a very, yeah, and mapping and charting and freelancers. Maybe we'll talk about that more. I'm also very passionate about that because I actually think we have some, you know, using my gamer terminology, some buffs, some good things, some advantages where maybe other industries don't have them. There was an organizer in the AFM who used to say, who used to accentuate this all the time, which is like musicians can map and chart so easily because we tell each other where we are, right?
Yeah.
We've got a gig that we're telling people about. So we really know who we tell each other about each other. So we're very public in that way. This is an advantage for us. There's a lot of us.
Yeah.
That's also an advantage. But it is also challenging to really map and chart everyone. I really feel for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to remind everybody who's watching, if you do want to leave a comment or have a question, we will see that in the chat live here. So feel free to ask any questions you have as we're going through our interview today. But yeah, so mapping and charting, you're right. I mean, like, for example, like with an orchestra, like for us, like, I'm not going to say organizing is ever easy because it's not, but the most simplest in terms of organizing would be a collective bargaining, what we would call a collective bargaining unit. And we can talk a little bit about that for people that are not familiar with these terms, but basically that's labor law in America works really well for people who have a regular steady job where they're reporting to, say, the same location, they're working with the same group of people. And as we know, that's not really freelancers. But in those cases where we have that in the music industry, again, like the management is going to publish all of the musicians who played the last concert. Like all we have to do is map and chart is to get the program, you know? So in some ways it can be, you're right, it can be a lot more simpler for us than other workers, other unions who are trying to build those lists, as you say.
Yeah, it's never one thing, right? So while it is great that we share, we can look up, oh, this person's playing this gig. At the end of the day, they're and we'll get into this more later too, right? Yeah, it doesn't have that NLRB, National Labor Relations Board structure that really allows for that one employer to these employees, right? In the freelance space that we're talking about today, it could be 500 employees, 500 workers, and 100 employees, right? Who you're piecing together your work. And this is the challenge, right? This is how we've been structured for 50 years. It's not how we've always been structured. And so, and really organizing, as I've defined it for you today, is not something we've ever resourced and attempted in this field.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that we as a union, the American Federation of Musicians, have done as much as we could. I think there's been a lot of hand wringing, and there were some really bad labor decisions that turned us into, the original Uber drivers, and we're going to talk a little bit about that too, in terms of degrading that employer-employee relationship. And very briefly, what would happen before 1978 or whenever the rulings were, you might be hired by to play a showroom at a Hilton hotel. Hilton would be the employer; they would pay you. There was a clear relationship there, and then these rulings basically these were challenged by some hotels and venues that said, no, we're not the employer; we're just renting out the space. And so when people say musicians are the original Uber drivers, that's kind of what they mean. I think, like the fact that that erosion of the employer-employee, oh no, you're not working for Uber, you're just an independent contractor and you're choosing to do this and all of that, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that idea of what that sort of original gig worker model?
Yeah, I think you explained it really well, referencing the Uber drivers. I think we all know how ridiculous it is that Uber drivers are limited in their ability to organize and to get benefits and to have a voice at the table, all under the guise that, well, we don't tell them when to open the app. I mean, okay. Right. But that's just yeah, so, that line, that kind of magical just decision, right? That, because we don't tell you when and where, we're not your employers. We're just a pass-through of some kind. It's a fiction. It's a fiction that has been lobbied for by many chambers of commerce, by many organizations, by many employers, right? Who don't want to be employers. Right. So I think it's just really important to remember that too, right? Money talks, and money talked in the 70s. And all of this is connected to political movements, right? We should be very aware of that. We do not live in a non-political void as musicians. There are people who are lobbying constantly, sometimes on our behalf, right? The AFN has a legislative advocacy group, but it's good logic that our employers will always have more money to spend on lobbying than we will, always. And that's true of any industry. So this line, this legislative line, it's a really unfortunate one. It's a really cruel one. And it exploits, not figuratively, probably 250,000 musicians in our country, right? It allows this pathway of exploitation. And really it degrades our whole industry long term, right? When we aren't treated with dignity. So it's also a values choice, right? In my opinion, that some of these things we just have to say, look, it's my value that workers, look, this club is telling you when and where to be. They're your employer.
Yeah. And even more broadly, the minimum wage has not gone up since 2009, right? So all workers, unless we have the right advocacy and we have all of these things together, like the natural level is against us, right? It's never going to be in our favor. We do have a question here, which says, hi, Michael, and hi, Hannah. Any thoughts on organizing the Orchestra of the Spider-Verse tour? I'm going to assume this is like a multi-city tour. I haven't researched it, with an orchestra that's been hired to go around and play different venues. So I have my own thoughts, but let's start with you, Hannah.
Well, so I'm a local organizer. I organize in the Bay Area. Yeah. And certainly I think I could put on my personal cap here, including SF. Hell yeah. So personally, I'm down to help any workers, organize anything that, especially if it passes through San Francisco, in my work time, I focus on the Bay Area, but Michael knows I volunteer and I support workers in many different areas. But I think this question also gives the opportunity to just discuss how much there is, right? When we are in a state of not organizing, things slip by like this, right? So any orchestra, I'm just talking to anybody right now. If you're in an orchestra right now that's touring, that's not organized, that it has one employer to one employee, you have massive rights that you can utilize. You can organize, and I would happily give you all of the support you need to make that happen. There are steps. It's not, we like to say, it's not magic. It's method. Organizing is method. And so there are steps you can take to have these conversations that I've been talking about in a really structured and powerful and energy-driven way, so that you can win what's called a collective bargaining agreement, right? If you are in an unorganized space, that's where it starts. Perhaps with more infrastructure, we would be more, again, I'm only at the local level, but I would also be interested in supporting any kind of cross, maybe we could get a couple locals, we could figure out where this passes through, get a couple locals in on it, and have plenty of support for that orchestra.
Yeah.
Organizing always starts with one thing. Not always, I'm being hyperbolic, but 90% of the time, unless you've got folks who are really strategizing, mapping out the whole, industry, usually it starts what's called an initial contact, right? With the worker who maybe calls an organizer, maybe they call their union, maybe they call a friend who they know is in a collective bargaining. Call your friend. If you know your friend is in a collective bargaining agreement, call them, ask them about it. They'll help you connect the dots and get there, right? So it's a perhaps not a direct answer. I think my most direct answer is to this Facebook user we have no name for. I think about organizing everything. I think every musician should have a collective bargaining agreement. So, really, Michael and I, we're very much of the mind that all musicians should have collective bargaining agreements or agreements. Our power to do that is limited.
Yeah, and I think I just want to chime in because how we've expected these things to be organized in the past is kind of a symptom of a problem, right? So as Hannah said, when we're seeing the comments, unless you've given permission to StreamYard, we don't actually know who you are. So it just says Facebook user. So if you'd like to identify yourselves, feel free, you don't have to, but we apologize for not being able to address you by name because we're just seeing Facebook user on our screen. And we have another question that I want to get to, but let's finish with this one first. So my first question about the Spider-Verse tour, is it touring with all the musicians? Is it picking up all the musicians? Eric Stockton. Hey, Eric, great to see you watching.
Oh, hey, Eric.
And so if they're touring with all the musicians, that's less complicated, right? So then I would say you want to start mapping and charting, right? Who's been hired. In the past, the way we've, quote, organized within our work as musicians is we say, I hope the contractor is going to make this a union job. Like, that's how we organize. And if the contractor doesn't make it a union job, we just throw up our hands and say, well, I guess this isn't a union job. Like that doesn't help in terms of the question, but like, that's the problem, right? That's where we've come from. And so I think one tactic would be to do what they do in the building trades and organize all the contractors, right? So, but that also takes power, right? And we'd have to have a lot of density and a lot of power to get to that place. But I think in terms of organizing a tour that is maybe about to go out, find out who the other musicians are, see if you can start that process of having conversations. And in this case, you would have a clear employer-employee relationship and you could potentially get a contract for that tour. One of the challenges I will say is that if the tour is 6 months long, you might get recognition and the tour might be over before you can proceed any further, because the wheels turn slowly in the organizing process and in the labor recognition process as well.
Can I jump in there about
Yeah.
that? Every time I've said this is something that I've started saying this week, because I've heard in my work, recently, just the past couple of weeks with a few ensembles, well, we could go through we're going to go through the negotiation process, but the boss won't change. Yeah, maybe not. Organizing isn't about changing the boss. It's about the power we have to change ourselves, right? What do I mean? I mean, the change of all being on the same page or not. And I think that I don't want to make that seem that it's not, we don't want to change the employer, of course, but we want to empower ourselves. And that's the change I think that this whole podcast is all about, right? Is, us feeling empowered as workers and as musicians. And so I don't know. Yes, there's a lot of work that happens. Why did I bring this up? There's a lot of work that happens that's in a short period of time.
Yeah.
And we can be really discouraged by that as musicians and as workers. But let's say, Spider-Verse was organized and there were only 2 jobs that ended up being on this recognized contract. Well, the next time it comes around, those, I don't know, how many workers is it? 10, 15? They've changed. They've gone through a process that has empowered them, that now the next time that let's say it's Captain Marvel verse, tour or something like that, right? Maybe Captain Marvel goes on tour and we're ready. We've done it before, we can do it again, right? And that's the dynamic that I think too is not happening, right? We're not, and Michael and I talk about this a lot. It's like, we should not, every win is a win that is probably more about us at that point than at this point, right? Than the employers. Like if entropy is a really important piece of this, which I believe it is, we don't have a lot of it right now. And so, and I'm not just talking about the AFM, I'm just talking about in general. There's not like a win to a win to a win to a win, right? Like we're seeing in UAW and SAG-AFTRA, and the power that they are showing is massive, right? It's massive. I guarantee that you could find a connection all the way back from some original win that started that entropy, that started that movement. And so, and there's great literature about that. That's really empowering, like reading about Martin Luther King Jr., like that was his whole concept, right? Nonviolent action, it builds, it grows. So, I know, Michael, it can be challenging. And like we often get in these headspaces of, well, we could organize this, but it'll be done in 3 months. Well, let's do it. And let's see if we're ready, and we're more ready for the next one.
Yeah.
So I really want to give that encouragement to all workers who maybe play a tour, or you're in a commercial setting where, you're playing a gig in your town for a month while it's there, or you're doing a Fever Up show, right? You're doing Bridgerton Live, right? Bridgerton Live was only 2 or 3 months long in each city that it was in.
Yeah.
But there was incredible worker power, right? That could have been supported and across the whole country, could have been tied together, and they could have won a really good agreement that would have built for a future Fever production. If you haven't heard of Fever and you're a musician, you should look them up, because they're trying to be the Amazon of the music industry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, we should be very aware of that.
Yeah. And I do want to sort of amend my statement before, because I'm sort of more thinking about a traditional for AFM, which is not a terribly highly internal organized process. But workers should know that, like let's say you're on the Spider-Verse tour. Yes, if it's over in 6 months or 7 months, the employer could drag their feet, but the employer's not going to drag their feet if no musician goes on stage, right? Like, this is where our power is. If we can shut down production or threaten to, and we had a really amazing campaign with an HBO production of all things, and it was a 30 musicians, let's say, who were hired for a couple scenes as what we call sideline. So they were playing instruments in this show called The Gilded Age, and they wanted an AFM contract, and they were treated like they had no power, right? But when push came to shove, they got the actors on board, and they threatened to shut down shooting for 3 days. Wow. And HBO signed the contract, right? Because when you have the power to stop the flow of money, to interrupt production, that's really where your power is. And if I would imagine that if you're touring on the Spider-Verse tour, nobody's going to be able to fly in a new orchestra with no rehearsal in 4 hours to replace you. So
and if they try that, let's call those musicians and make sure they don't go on the line, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
we have that power.
Yeah. So we have a lot of power that we haven't really considered and celebrated and used in the past in that way. So I think that's really important to think about. But Eric, I'm sure that Hannah and I would be happy to talk to you offline about the more specific details, because honestly, I don't know all the details. But if it's hiring a different orchestra in every city, that's a different kind of way to get to the same result. But it's a really good question. But I would say, in the past, we've just relied on the contractor being a benevolent person who's going to do the right thing, and that can work if you have all the contractors organized, right? And we just don't right now. So we do have another.
We don't even have them all on a list.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't even mapped them all. So another question: do you think organizations like Maestra are exacerbating the intrinsic challenges with this type of organizing? I'm actually not that familiar with what Maestra is. It sounds like something for female conductors. So if you want to elaborate more, I don't know if that's Eric or someone else asking that question. But I will say in terms of,
I think I could answer this question.
Yeah.
I'm looking at Maestra, and I'm going to take it away from Maestra. Actually, what I'm about to say has nothing to do with Maestra.
Can you tell us what Maestra is, Joe? For those of us who are not searching, but
yeah, it looks like a really cool organization. It is an organization that provides support, visibility, and community to women and non-binary people who make the music in the musical theater industry. And they're kind of cross-discipline.
Yeah.
So not just musicians, just in the musical theater industry. Again, I'm not commenting on Maestra. What I'm commenting on now is organizations who are probably started by impacted musicians, right? Who have a need, who feel like there's community that's not being built, that there are things that they want to solve, right? And that they don't look immediately to the union. I say that with quotes, right? Because I prefer if we would call it our union. We own it. It is ours. We are it. It is nothing without us, unless it just wants to be a bunch of money in the bank. But there have been a lot of organizations that have popped up that I want to celebrate and I want to talk about, because maybe they're not unions yet. I'm seeing your chats. But I think Maestra is a good example of many organizations that pop up to solve need, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that should be celebrated. I think that's examples of folks who are like, we need to figure things out. And generally speaking, people don't figure out how to organize overnight. So they have to try some things. I've had several people come to me and share about, independent unions that they want to start for musicians. And they're like, yeah, but we don't want to do CBAs. We're not going to do that. And I'm like, you're probably going to run into them, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we're all in this together. We're all trying to solve these problems. I want to be a voice from within the AFM that says to those folks, congratulations. Let's all band together and keep doing this work, right? Because we're going to be more powerful together. The union is nothing without those women and non-binary folks who are trying to solve this. The union's nothing without the Independent Musicians Alliance in San Francisco, who's been organizing for 5 years. Is nothing without all of these amazing organizations who are really trying, and we can be great partners and support them and encourage them. And if there's, especially around pay, working conditions, and being treated with dignity in every way, I think that should be the way that we feel about it. I think sometimes we get a little territorial. I don't think that they're at all a problem. I don't think that they're the problem. Let me tell you that. I think that they are a reaction to the problem. And so I want to really support and honor and love on their work because, it may not be union, but we have to all be in this together at this point. The American Federation has 54,000 members. We really need to be loving and kind to all of the people who are out there trying to do good work and support them. And no, I didn't get the sense you were, Eric, suggesting not to celebrate them. But I do get the sense sometimes people are, they do get a little territorial. And so I just want to really trumpet as loud as possible that these organizations, we should really lift them up and support them. That's been our way in Local 6, when organizations like this come along, we could get stodgy and say, no, just listen to us, do it the way we want, right? But I love it when people figure things out themselves. And there's so much that we have to do. That's not just contracting, right? We do need to do legislative advocacy. We do need more mutual aid. We do need all those things. So I get excited by those things. And I don't think that they're hurting. I think that they're building the structures we'll need for those future union CBA fights, for those future fights, right? They're building structures that we desperately need.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would say that is a challenge is that organizations like Maestra are not looking to their union as a place and a space where they can solve that problem, and that's the bigger problem. And I think that has to do maybe with just density and with other things, but and with a lot of third partying of the union, right? If people say if the folks that started Maestra see AFM as external to themselves, they're not going to naturally say this is something our union should be behind and help building with us. And so I think we see a lot of these organizations that are saying, hey, musicians need mutual aid and support, and they're not necessarily connecting that with AFM. So, and that's a challenge that we should face, I think, going forward.
There was also a quote that I'm sort of living by from the convention. There was a presentation done that at the beginning, they used a quote like "move as fast as trust." I don't think we do that yet with these organizations. We really need to build trust and show that this is a loving organization, that this is an organization that can be power built on our love for each other, right? And our love for our music and our love for our instruments, not on our structures that have been built in the past that sometimes make people feel really uncomfortable in our space. Mm-hmm. And yeah, now I've totally lost it. I'm talking about love on a podcast, but I believe that, yeah. I had to unwire, if I can, Michael, when I first learned how to organize, it was with a much heavier hands, right? I had to unwire that and had to read, about more Martin Luther King, more folks who were Martin Luther King Jr., more folks who were actually out there and like, what did they lead with? They led with love every time. So I think that it's just really important. We shouldn't be afraid of that word. It's essential to organizing, our care for each other. And I think we can fall short of that more often than not.
Yeah,
and that's not just the AFM. That's like a lot of organizations. We forget that that's the most important thing.
Yeah, that's really important. Because it's work to do this, and it's challenging, and we have to have that feeling of love and support for each other, or else we're not going to make it, I don't think.
Yeah.
That's great. So moving on to the specific work that you're doing in the Bay Area, a lot of people just kind of assume that there's no way to quote organize freelancers, and so let's talk a little bit about how you're challenging that and what you're doing up there.
So I want to start by just sharing kind of two big buckets with people that I want people to start thinking about organizing in. I'm going to try to be as specific as possible. So there's what we would call traditional organizing and then non-traditional organizing. Traditional organizing is what we've described: employer, employee, boom. You go for your CBA, you get all your cards signed, you have an election, you have rights that they cannot take away from you. And then we have folks who are cut out of that. And now we're stepping into this space. And that's what we call non-traditional organizing, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe someday the whole point of our non-traditional organizing is to get that big bucket of people into the opportunity of traditional organizing, right? So non-traditional organizing has to have non-traditional goals, right? The goal is not necessarily contract with employer, right? Mm-hmm. The central tactic and the central focus, though, in non-traditional organizing for you not to lose your way and to move into advocacy is that you're always increasing the number of people who are connected to each other, talking and decision-making. So I come out of a lot of non-traditional organizing, and I bring that here to the local Bay Area. And I've been doing this work in the Bay Area for almost 2 years now. Lisa's in the chat. She's on one of my committees.
That's awesome.
Hey, Lisa, nice to see you. So in non-traditional organizing, there are a couple of really essential things showed up here and had what I described to you earlier as an initial contact, right? I'm going to keep people's names anonymous, but with a really awesome guy that I love. And we had this initial contact, almost 2 years ago now. And we immediately, the first thing I asked John Doe, the first thing I asked John was, look, who do we need to talk to next? Like, who are the people you need in a space with you to start? Who are the leaders in your community? We talked about leaders, we talked about activists, and we started building out a nice crew of people to really think about what would be a good first goal, right? Mm-hmm. Because with freelancers, it's massive, right? We've got clubs, we've got wineries, we've got corporate gigs, we've got wedding gigs, we've got city gigs, we've got teaching, and I could go on and on and on, right? I think many of you know that in freelance world, you're piecing together so many different gig types is what we call them. And this committee, they really honed in on what they felt they could start with first, right? That they could build power around. And that's city gigs. So we feel in Local 6 in the South Bay, and just conceptually, that if a city, just like if they were hiring a painter or if they were hiring a contractor, that there would be a procurement standard. If you've never heard that word, you've heard it now. Procurement standard, essentially, right? If a city, like I just said, if a city needs a service that wouldn't be a full-time employee, someone who's on the books every day, they have to have a fair and equitable procurement standard, right? They can't just call their buddy. The city councilor can't just call their buddy and have them paint the city hall, right? That would be horrible. And it should be the exact same way for musicians, trades, unions in the trade movement. If you didn't know, we're a union in the trade movement. One of the largest. We were one of the largest and most powerful at one point. They have had some of these procurement standards across the country in right to work states, in the deep South, in the Midwest, and everywhere. Procurement standards exist everywhere. And so these musicians, when they were like, oh, well, city gigs, sometimes cities are paying $100 with no pension, no security, no working standards. What if it's 100 degrees out? I mean, it can get 100 degrees in the Bay Area, in the South Bay. What's the process? There's none of that. There's no structure like that. And they saw that as a great opportunity, right? Because unlike going to a club where you wouldn't have that many power dynamics, right? It's all the workers and the employer. In this situation, the employer is the city councilor, right? Who is beholden to their citizens. So this gives us extra power to go out there to bring all musicians together, and really, make something happen in that world. I think, Michael, you're breaking up a little bit.
Am I back?
I think so.
Okay.
So I think you're back.
Okay. I can hear you.
So essentially, in this non-traditional organizing sphere, right, we've cut our first non-traditional campaign. That will lead to contracts for musicians, of course, and better wages and better standards. But it's not the traditional, everyone sign a card and then we're going to go to the employer, right? We are slowly but surely, we've just crested 100 actually as of last night. Shout out to Lisa actually on that. We've got our petition, right? We want to get as many musicians on the front end. Because remember how I've talked about this whole time, it's all about organizing is not about making decisions for people. It's bringing people together to make decisions. So we're still in that process, and our values make this really tricky, right? Because we feel like we could probably move on one of these cities, but we're waiting, right? Because we want to bring all the musicians, the impacted musicians together, or at least a decent representation of them, 40, 50% in the South Bay, to really decide on what they think these city gigs should look like, what matters to them, right? And that's our campaign there in the South Bay. We have other work going on, of course, but that's the freelance work that we're doing, and it's just the beginning, and it takes a lot of and I'm really proud of our committee for not losing sight of the fact that, like, we had a little bit of a challenge there from getting like 60 to 100. And the committee didn't lose sight of their values. They're like, we're not going to jump on one of these cities yet. We are going to get people together. That's the goal. The city gigs are actually alternative to that. That's just the first thing we're doing together, right? So that's what non-traditional organizing looks like, right? It's really new organizing is what it's called as well.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think one of the things that we've touched on, but I want to make explicit, is that there are these methods, right? And there are these kind of like standards and formulas, if you will. Like 2 + 2 = 4. It's never going to equal 6, right? And if you want to organize anybody, whether it's you think you need a stop sign in your neighborhood, right? You need to find out, how many people are affected, and then you need to get a supermajority support of those people, whether it's a petition or not, right? So 75, 85%, 90% of people. You can't go to the city hall and say we demand a stop sign if you have 30% support, right? So one of the things we talk about is the supermajority support. And so it's good that your committee recognized that they had to actually reach that 100 goal, because that was the goal they set for themselves. They couldn't stop at 60. That's really an important point to raise, I think.
Yeah, and I think this just begs the question. I think we should be explicit about what are we talking about now? We're talking about power, right?
Yeah.
Other people got it. We want it. We don't want power over. We want power with and power to. That's a really important distinction, right? So a lot of people have power over, right? These city councilors, in theory, they have power over this situation, right? We build power with each other to do things together. And I think that's really important. You can create power in other ways, but those should be the values that you lead with when organizing, that you're never trying to have power over people, right? Never. And if you are, ugh, I mean, that's horrible. But we see this all the time, that most people would rather have power over people, right? We don't want to be afraid of power. Some people get uncomfortable with it. That's not going to work either. So we just have to be really explicit about that. And these musicians in the South Bay know that real power is going to come when they're all acting together, and they're all making decisions together.
Yeah. And so on that point, I did want to give you a space to talk about a panel that you're involved with or you're hosting. And this is going to be virtual, right?
Yeah, it's going to be virtual.
And this is, how do folks find out about it? And it's really basically a panel on gig workers and what you guys are doing up in the Bay Area.
Yeah, I'll give you a breakdown on the event. And actually, Lisa, if you're there, could you put I can't for some reason.
Yeah, we can't actually respond to chats in the chat. So Lisa, if you'd like to put a link in the chat.
If you want to put a link to our sign-in, Lisa, that would be awesome. But if not, I'll say it out loud as well.
Yeah.
So the event is the original gig worker, how musicians will organize and take our power back. Why are we holding this panel? It is not just to have a panel. Everything we do in the South Bay is about further engagement, further reasons, making excuses to talk to each other. So that's why we're having that panel, right? We decided to have the panel and include folks from across the country. We've included 5 folks who have organized in various ways. Some of them are in organizations like Maestra. We have a non-member who's going to be on the panel, who's organized really great stuff with an organization called Whippoorwill Arts. We've got Nate Omdahl, who's been doing fair trade organizing for a really long time. We've got Mont Chris, who's in Local 99. They've just hired their first organizer, and they're really digging in on organizing fair trade music PDX. We've got Mario Guarneri, who is really awesome. I've already mentioned him. He started the Independent Musicians Alliance, right? Because he felt like our union wasn't doing enough, right? Because it wasn't, right? And we've also got Blair Robbins, who's down in Austin, Texas, who's actively organizing around the South by Southwest, doing also city organizing, right? Organizing around city legislative possibilities. So by bringing all of these folks together who are organizing and sharing ideas, right? We're all all of us doing little different things, right? So let's come together. Let's share what we've been doing. Maybe we can learn from each other. And at the same time, the whole point is to go out into our communities and saying, look, we're having this event, not to just have the event and talk. I know Nate. I could call him. He just texted me. He's at another meeting with freelancers, right? No, the point is to get folks together. So the structure of the panel is going to be an opening question so you can learn about the panelists and the work they're doing. Then we're going to have a history of freelance work, like why we're going to dig into the consent decree of 1979, like Michael's brought up, and how we went from independent or from workers, from employers and employee relationship to an independent contractor relationship. Then we're going to go into just 3 more questions that have been prepared to really dig into what everyone is doing so we can learn from each other. We're going to talk about tactics. We're going to talk about real, method, not magic, right? What can we really do to start to continue to organize and to put these pieces together? And then finally, the last portion is going to be, actually, there's 2 more. Then we're going to have open question and answer. We're going to get through that first part as quick as possible because we want open question and answer. We really want folks to who engage, right, and who come to be able to communicate like what's on their mind. Maybe we can't answer every question, right? We actually, in fact, we will not be able to, or we're super disingenuous. But we will be able to have those questions and hold them together, right? And that's the whole point. And finally, we're going to end with kind of a regional breakout. So because there's panelists from all over the country, because this is an open event, even though we have our specific reasons, we're running this event for Local 6 organizing and to engage with folks in Local 6. Everyone who's a panelist is using it in their own way, right? So if you have a group of musicians you're organizing and you're listening to this right now, you can use this event, right, to say, hey, look, let's go to this event. Let's see what other people are doing. And then you're going to be put in a group at the very end to just connect with people in your general region who are interested in organizing, right? And y'all can take it from there. So, hey, Dusty.
Hey, Dusty.
Dusty, it's for anyone. And in fact, we would even love to have a Canadian panelist. I'm just saying there's room. So really it's for everyone to utilize how they want to. Again, we're running it for our own specific reasons in Local 6, but we wanted to be open, right? We know the reality is it takes resources, right? What are our resources? That's the last question we asked at the beginning of this. What are our resources to make change? Well, we know that there's people across the country who are strapped for those. So by having it be open and anyone can utilize the event how they want, they can focus on just the one-to-one, right? We'll be doing the web hosting. We've got the link, the registration. We're going to do the regional breakout rooms. All you have to think about is, who do I want in this room with me to continue the conversation on how we're going to go from gig workers to workers who have a voice at the table, whatever that looks like in the future, whether it's procurement standards, contracts at clubs, contracts with production companies, right, who are sending you out to weddings and corporate gigs, right? Yeah. Whatever it is, all you need to focus on is you and your fellow workers, a couple of you getting there. And you can utilize it however you want. So, we're excited to give this, to do this, right? I'm a staff member, so I'm a resource. We are happy to share resources because, again, who are my people? What are their urgent issues? And what resources do they have? We know resources are really tough. So please utilize this however you'd like to bring people together in your community. And you will have that opportunity at the end to see who comes from your community, who comes from your region. And be careful. I may tap you to run that regional room if I have no one else to do it and I see you on the list. So yeah, just really excited. Everyone is invited.
And what date is that? When is that happening?
That's the most important part. October 2nd at 4 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Mountain, 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern.
Awesome. October 2nd. And Lisa kindly put in the link for us. It's bit.ly/the original gig worker, no spaces. So I think the next show we should do together is on the conversation. I would love to do that.
On an organizing conversation?
Yeah. Wouldn't that be
Oh
fun?
man, that would be fun. The organizing conversation, for those who don't know, Michael just brought up like the tool.
Yeah.
As we've talked about, organizing is not magic. It never has been. It never will be. All of the great nonviolent organizers would tell you that. And so one of the methods we have is the organizing conversation. And spoiler alert, there's like 20. But
Yeah.
but they're all great. They all come from different, nonviolent organizing traditions that should be celebrated. So yeah, the organizing conversation. I could talk about it for another hour.
Yeah. Yeah. And I look forward to that because really, again, it's like a conversation that really gets people to identify issues that are important to them and then take action, which is how it's different than regular conversation, right? So I think it would be, I'm just thinking of that out loud. Like that would be a great subject for one of our podcast episodes here. Well,
maybe we could get, someone else as well from another industry who's like done thousands, I
yeah,
mean,
that'd be fun. And
I've done maybe 8,000 or maybe 1,500. I don't know.
That's great.
I'm not who's counting, but it's not again, one of the organizers I trained under who used to be the lead organizer of the AFM, he used to say that a good organizer would do, minimum 10 a week and, minimum 300 a year. If that gives you a sense for how this tactic is utilized, it's not casual, right?
Yeah.
And like Michael said, the organizing conversation, it's all about moving someone, right? It's that change. I think a good place to end is actually, maybe where my mind has been all week, which is don't think about changing your employer. That's not where you start. You start with changing yourself, going to your coworkers and saying, we need to change how we relate to each other, how we relate to power, how we relate to action. That's what organizing is all about. It's actually not about the employer. I know that sounds crazy, but it's not. We can't change people, who we can't talk to or who are across the table from us necessarily, but we can talk to our fellow coworkers. We can really engage with each other in a way we never have before as freelancers. And yeah, it's not the laws that need to change. They do. But it really is us and our ability to continue to talk to each other.
Yeah, and that's a great way to sum up. And I just want to congratulate Lisa and her colleagues for all the work they're doing. Congratulations, Eric, for all the work you're doing in the theater world of touring theater. Would love to catch up with you soon. And to Dusty as well for the work she does up in Canada. And thank you, Hannah, so much for your sharing your afternoon with your late morning with us here on the West Coast time here. Eric, I am going to call you, so we'll talk next week. And so I was just thinking about a colleague that I work with now who worked for SEIU. It'd be so fun to bring her and you on this podcast and maybe to model a conversation for us at some point and to talk about that conversation. I haven't had as many issues because I've been always maybe a director of organizing, and now I'm more doing sort of legislative organizing and things like that. But it's a skill that takes a lot of work. So next time, look for us talking about the organizing conversation. And thank you again, Hannah, for your time today.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who came. Thanks to Michael and who ends up watching this later. Thanks to Michael for putting these on. In general, I think we need more things like this. The Empowering Musician podcast, I think, is just a really practical way for us to keep talking to each other.
Well, thank you for that. And I need to get it out there more. And I'm not very good at marketing it, but I think we're creating a body of content that's really valuable that I think is going to go somewhere. And really quickly, how do folks is the original gig worker group that you're working with and the freelancers, do they have Facebook and Instagram, and how do folks find you there?
Yeah, so actually, I'm not going to point you towards any listener who's out there who's a freelancer who's like, how do I get engaged? I'm going to point you towards the independent gig musicians who are meeting nationally every Saturday. So if you register for our program, at that bit.ly/ the original gig worker, I'll say that again because I messed it up. bit.ly/ the original gig worker. If you go to that and you go to that event, I'm going to connect you into the independent gig musicians, because that's a group of folks who have been meeting consistently and at that international level. I'm sorry, my bad. I said national, but it should have said international. So they're meeting at that international level. I go to those meetings occasionally. Those are headed up by a couple of really great folks, Nate Omdahl being one of them. So we have structures that are now international that can support those initial conversations. You're always welcome to reach out to me at Hannah, HANNAH @afm6.org to connect those dots. I'm definitely, willing to make sure that every freelancer knows when those meetings are. They're every Saturday and every Tuesday night for increased accessibility. So again, please come to that event. The event is for everyone. And certainly I'm not going to not have a conversation and support someone, but there are freelancers at the international level who've been talking and doing a lot of great work. So I think actually they just ended their last meeting, so I couldn't be there to be here for this. So I did want to give them the shout out for that as well. There are structures that are, being built and honed and improved upon within the AFM that folks can plug into.
That's awesome. So look for independent gig musicians. Do sign up for bit.ly, bit.ly, the original gig worker. And thank you, Hannah, so much for being here. And we will look forward to seeing everybody next time.
All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.